unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Linda Colley, who's a professor of history at Princeton University and also the author, most recently, of this book, The Gun, the Ship, and the Pen, and also the author of a couple of, I think, really seminal books from a while back, one called Britain's Forging the Nation, and its companion book, Captives, Britain, Empire, and the World. Also one called The Ordeal of Elizabeth Marsh, and this little book called The Acts of Union and Disunion. Welcome, Linda.
Hello. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Now, this book, Acts of Union and Disunion, was written right before a couple of important referenda in the UK, right? One around the future of Scotland and one around the future of the UK in the European Union, and I think it was a pretty timely book. I think if you were to write a book again, you would have to cover a lot of the same themes because it's not always entirely clear to people what it means to be a UKer. I guess you said no one ever uses that term. It's not a real term, right? It's to be a Briton or to be an Englishman. But what I find interesting about England is that, or the UK or Britain, is that they take pride in being this country which has no written constitution. I mean, this is a feature, and yet England has been the inspiration for constitutions around the world. And there is this notion that constitutions and the proliferation of constitutions over the last couple hundred years represents the spread of republicanism and the demise of monarchies. And I think the purpose of this latest book is to show that the history of paper constitutions is much more complicated, and that sometimes it is imposed. They are imposed from the top down, and in fact, some of the writers of constitutions have in fact been rulers of empires. So I guess the first question I have for you is: you describe constitutions as a political technology, and I was very intrigued by this term. What do you mean by a political technology? How does it make sense for us to think about this innovation as a political technology?
Well, one of the things I tried to do in The Gun, the Ship, and the Pen was to look at constitutions across borders, across oceans, to try and explain why they start becoming far more numerous and an accepted thing to do from about 1750 onwards. There'd been outlier constitutions earlier, but these kind of more conscious, written and increasingly printed and widely distributed constitutions are really a post-1750 development. And in the book, I trace how that comes to be, and I go up to the First World War. That isn't obviously because written constitutions stopped then, but because they effloresce after that so much that you'd need a separate book, if not a separate two books, to tell the 20th and early 21st century story. So I just wanted to get them as an accepted genre in almost every continent by 1914, indeed in every continent by 1914. And I use the term technology because I wanted to indicate that increasingly these kind of documents did become a technology that different polities acting out of different ambitions and with different ruling systems could plug into. To say that is not to dismiss the legal and political and increasingly democratic significance of these texts, but to see them as instruments that crossed countries, that crossed seas and oceans. And I wanted to find out why.
So these were things that people within, they could sort of download them, right? I mean, it's like an operating system that you could download and customize to some degree, right?
Well, actually, obviously they couldn't download in the late 18th, 19th, early 20th century. But what they increasingly did do, and publishers got into this fast, was publishers started producing not just the text of one constitution, they started bundling together the texts of multiple constitutions. And these kind of compendia became very useful for governments wanting to initiate or amend a constitution, particularly if they had to act quickly, because they could say, oh, I really like that bit in Argentina's constitution, or, oh, that Hawaiian constitution really hits it on the spot. And if you analyze the makeup of some constitutions, and the Norwegian Constitution of 1814 is an extreme example, you can see them adopting sentences, sometimes whole paragraphs, because the Norwegians had to act quickly before a Swedish army was moving in. And so they had to do this in a matter of weeks. And so they bought and acquired all these compendia of constitutions, and they just sort of cut and pasted. Obviously, they added stuff of their own, but many constitutions plagiarize. The great Indian constitution, for example, is substantially based, though people don't necessarily want to acknowledge that, on a document that was substantially designed in London in the 1930s. So, you know, constitution writers, like other kinds of writers, often borrow.
Yeah, you call this the art of pick and mix, which I liked. I like that term. It's like assembling a song out of various beats and lines from other songs. But I think when most people think about constitutions, they think about the revolutions that spawned them, like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution. And they think of the inspiration of the Constitution as some kind of bulwark against tyranny, right? And Jeremy Bentham used that famous phrase, security against misrule. And yet, you point out that lots of rulers who didn't necessarily have any strong interest in having their hands tied would, in fact, promulgate the implementation of these constitutions. So should we be thinking of them as something different from a device to protect against tyranny? Should we just think of them as a way for rulers to strengthen their power by enfranchising people and making them serve in the military in exchange? Is that a big part of the story?
I think constitutions, as they evolve, have two fundamental aims. First of all, they are designed to constitute legitimate rule. And that's why, as you say, they have often been introduced after revolutions or a dramatic change in power, because the new regime needs to constitute itself and legitimize itself. So that's the first thing they do. But secondly, what they increasingly do is they set out instructions for rule, and increasingly they set out regulations on how the rulers work. So to that extent, they're somewhat hybrid documents. They serve the interest of the ruling power, but they are likely to impose regulation and limitations as well. Now, the balance of that shifts over constitutions and over time, but I wasn't I wasn't concerned in this book to downgrade the importance of revolutions. Far from it. You could argue that in my own country of birth, Britain, the only time it did create a fully codified constitution, and this is disputed, but you can make the argument, is in 1653, when Charles I has been executed. There's a republic dominated by Oliver Cromwell, and he pushes through Parliament the instrument of government. And that text, the instrument of government, covers Britain, Ireland, and also a few colonies. And it sets down rules, some of them very much favouring centralisation, some of them quite emancipatory, like increasing toleration for Jews, for example. So revolutions have been major prompters of new constitutions, but so have changing needs of government, which is where warfare makes its impress very often. That if you are having to up taxation, if you are fighting big wars where you need large armies and navies, and therefore you begin to think, hey, wouldn't conscription be useful? Then you want to appeal to the male population. And in the 19th century, it was just the male population. But you may want to give them something in return. So growing numbers of constitutions in the 19th century in Asia as well as in Europe and South America, parts of Africa, say conscription will be a duty for all male citizens of a certain age. But increasingly they also say there will be manhood suffrage.
Well, you discussed Napoleon and how he, in all of the places that he conquered, he would introduce a constitution, right? And a feature of that constitution was conscription, right? And some degree of enfranchisement, potentially, to go along with that conscription.
Yeah. He would also often lay out what amounts of money the conquered country had to pay towards his regime, and how many men they were to produce every year for his armies. But in return, yes, he would say again, toleration for the Jewish population, about which he felt strongly. He would carry out legal reform. He would expand the franchise, only to men, of course. He wasn't interested in that sense in women, because the view then was, what on earth could women contribute to warfare? So other than bearing healthy sons. So they didn't need the vote. But young males, you wanted to draw into the franchise and you wanted to use them on the battlefield.
Now, I think some political scientists are puzzled as to how this piece of paper, right, these words can make a difference. And I think Colley said that paper constitutions are like paper money, right? He was very suspicious of these things. Here in the U.S., of course, we have this reverence for the Constitution where everyone cites it as some kind of holy scripture. But in other countries, they seem to rip them up and replace them at will. So do we have any sense of what conditions make for a sticky constitution, one that is revered and respected and adhered to and not ripped up at will?
Well, here I've borrowed information from lots of historians, because if you write a global history, which is what the gun, the ship and the pen is, or aspires to be, you have to learn from your betters, fellow historians in other fields. And the Americanists that I consulted were often keen to point out that reverence for the Constitution in the United States has actually gone up and down. Eric Foner told me, for example, that before 1850, the American Constitution was often much less important to people than their state constitution. And indeed, when they referred to the Constitution, they often meant the Constitution of Massachusetts or whatever it was. And you got very few school books until the end of the 19th century in the US talking about the Constitution. And even after that, Jill Lepore wrote a great piece in the New Yorker a few years ago, and she pointed out that the original or manuscript text of the Constitution, which is now proudly on view in Washington, before the Second World War, this was not really the case. And indeed, at intervals, they actually lost it because they kept it in a sort of tin box in various official basements. And at certain times, people said, where is it? Where did we put it? So responses to the Constitution, treatment of the Constitution have varied sharply. As to what keeps constitutions working as an effective document, well, it depends, of course, if a regime stays in power. If, God forbid, the United States has a violent revolution next year, you might expect a new regime to introduce a new constitution. We would see. But also, you could argue that a healthy constitution, one that lasts but doesn't just last but does good work, needs regular amendments. And again, political scientists in the US, many of them argue that this is one of the challenges of the current US Constitution. It was deliberately made very difficult to amend. And because it is now very old, the oldest extant constitution by many criteria, and because there haven't been very many amendments, some would argue, that it is now out of date and it needs refurbishment on things like the Supreme Court, electoral rights in different parts of the United States, representation of the different states. That's not my squabble, but I can say as a historian that making it easier to amend a constitution is often an important factor in its effectiveness.
Yeah, I think you make the point that the amendments that followed the Civil War, it's almost as if we did adopt a new constitution. The changes were so fundamental.
Yes, and in the United States, war has been an important precipitant for amendments. I mean, after the First World War, there had been female voting in the states, in some of the states, but female enfranchisement overall only comes in with the First World War. And again, you could argue that's partly because women did start wearing military uniform here in the First World War. They started showing that they could play a role in warfare as well as in peace.
Mm-hmm. And you also talk about how constitutions serve as a type of propaganda, both internally and externally. And a lot of these countries, as soon as they would draft a new constitution, they would print a ton of copies and ship them everywhere, not just to their own citizens, but also they would ship them abroad so that others would have some sense of what this country is all about, right? And the U.S., of course, probably pioneered this practice, but we see subsequent examples of this type of diffusion of what we might call constitutional propaganda.
Absolutely. And as you say, the Americans start doing this early. During the American Revolutionary War, they distribute copies of the various state constitutions that are emerging. They are very busy subsequently in distributing copies of the Constitution drafted in Philadelphia in 1787. And the reason for distributing state constitutions during the Revolutionary War was really to advertise their political virtue, to show that this was a struggle for liberty and liberties. But distributing the federal constitution after 1787-89 has a rather different purpose. Yes, they want to show rights and liberty, but the men of Philadelphia also want to make clear to the world outside that the United States is going to be a more stable polity, that its economy will be regulated so that merchants can trade with the country and not be worried that they'll lose all their money, and that investors can invest in the United States with an expectation that their investments will be safe. So, and lots of countries subsequently follow suit, and it becomes very important that you make clear what new system of government you've got, to apprise foreign leaders, to indicate that you are you hope, a new and stable regime. And it's not just big, powerful countries that do that. It's often smaller, vulnerable countries. And I talked about how Hawaii, before it was taken over by the US in the 1890s, but before that, when it's trying to preserve its autonomy, the Hawaiian rulers, who are kings, really from the late 1830s right up to the 1890s, they're printing and publishing their new constitutions as an advertisement that they are modern, that they are a perfectly viable, albeit small, independent polity, and other powers should leave them alone. Obviously, after 1890, that ceases to work. But so constitutions, because they go into print, I mean, they now go online, can work as advertisements and proclamations to foreign audiences, not just something that caters to domestic and legal purposes.
Right, so it's a way of announcing that you have arrived. You talk about, there's some wonderful characters in the book that I didn't know about. You've got Pasquale Paoli. I think you start off the book with him in Corsica, and he's a pretty early figure. And then Henri Christophe in Haiti. I mean, and this guy Pomer in Tahiti. These are three characters that seem very important in the history of constitutions, but most people are unaware of them.
It was part of what I enjoyed writing about the book. I mean, I did it partly because constitutional history is very important, but it can seem arid and just legalistic. And I wanted to bring people in, the people who had the ideas, the people who wrote the constitutions, the people who helped the publicity of these devices. And I wanted to bring in people from small territories, not just the big states and empires that we know about and perhaps learn about at school and university. I wanted to bring little known names like Pomare, who a king of Tahiti, but a very interesting and very self-educated and nuanced man. And Paoli in Corsica, yes, in that case, a European figure, and someone who is defeated in the end, but who does draft in 1755 this Corsican constitution. He's rebelling against the rule of Genoa, which has treated Corsica rather like a colony. And he wants an independent Corsica, Paoli does. And so he drafts a constitution to announce this independence and to set out rules, and also to set out some restrictions on his power. But also, as he specifically says, that since he wants Corsicans to fight for their independence, they're not going to do that unless rights are extended to them. So this 1755 constitution, which does not last because the French armies move in the late 1760s and take over Corsica, it's still a French preserve. But this early attempt to use a constitution in Corsica was something that I wanted to start the book with. And anyway, Paoli needs more attention.
Mm-hmm. Well, you also talk about how the idea of a constitution was domesticated in some way by these non-Western countries, right? So how did the Constitution, the written Constitution, go from being something which was thought of as a Western phenomenon to something that was a global political technology? I mean, I was particularly interested in how the Meiji Constitution served as an inspiration for a lot of colonial people, precisely because it was not written by Western power, even if it borrowed heavily from, Prussian documents and so forth.
Yeah, I think that as the constitutions spread across geography, you get various tensions at work. At one level, as I've said, there is a lot of borrowing and copying in practice, always. But naturally, new states, and this is particularly true of states not in the West, they want to try and make sure that there is still something distinctive about their document and something different from the Western variety. So, for example, the great Indian Constitution, which comes into force in 1950, it's substantially based on a British-inspired document from the 1930s, but its makers in India are very concerned to show that this is something different. And one of the ways they do that, the initial draft of the Constitution in Delhi comes with pictures, artwork. Various artists are brought into the design of the Constitution, and they include images of Indian gods, Indian heroes, Indian artwork, so that the first constitution is made very beautiful, but it is also there to make the point that India is starting a new age. It's not a part of the British Empire anymore. It's starting a new age, and it's a new age that is a distinctively Indian and Asian experience. So you do see this simultaneously borrowing and an assertion of indigeneity, if you like.
Now, there was this guy named Ramahan Roy, who I'd never heard of, who drafted a earlier kind of Indian constitution, right, which would have, I guess, made India into a commonwealth of sorts earlier in the, I guess, late 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, Ramahan Roy is a figure that has received a lot more attention in the past 10 years. He's a leading liberal of a sort, based in Calcutta in the 1810s, 20s, early 30s, though he ultimately travels to Britain where he dies. But he's someone who's very interested in constitutions generally, and he develops a international reputation, so that when Spain produces its own amended constitution in the early 1820s, it's actually dedicated to this man, Ramahan Roy, because he's seen as a great liberal thinker and supporter of constitutions. But yes, he has, he owns various newspapers in various languages. He prints copies of other constitutions, particularly those from South America, but also the US Constitution. And he does make plans, very general plans, about what he would like to do for a more liberal India, a liberal India that would still be part of the British Empire and would accept the British monarchy, but would be an India where the inhabitants would be on a par with the British in political rights.
Well, you mentioned all of these Latin American constitutions. I mean, they proliferated like crazy, right, in the early 19th century. And you also mentioned in Spain there was sort of dueling constitutions at one point, where there was the Cadiz constitution that was being drafted in, I guess, English-supported Spain at the same time as the French side was drafting their own version of a constitution.
Yeah, again, you can see how important conflict is when Napoleon is marching around 1809, first into Portugal, then into Spain. He conquers a large part of Spain, and as he likes to do when he makes conquests, Napoleon has drafted a constitution for Spain and Spain's empire. So the free part of Spain, or the non-Napoleon controlled part of Spain, which is focused on Cadiz, says, well, you know, we're going to have to answer that document. So you do get this very famous Cadiz constitution, which is never fully implemented, but it becomes very famous because at one level, well, I think what's most distinctive about it, two things, I suppose. First, again, it tries to apply not just to Spain, but to Spain's empire in South America and Asia, and to bring different peoples into a kind of across the globe equality, so that all people in the Spanish world, apart from blacks, indigenous people, yes, Asian people, yes, not black people, will become equal Spanish citizens, if you like, if again they're men, with rights, with recognized written down rights. And that's an important thing that makes this document very important. But also, it's a specifically Catholic document, which gives, although it tolerates other religions, it gives priority to the Catholic Church. Now, obviously, some people really don't like that. I mean, there's letters between the Caddy constitution makers and constitutional people in the United States, and people like Madison are writing and saying, you know, why are you favoring the Catholic Church? You mustn't do that. You must separate church and state. But the Caddy guys know perfectly well that unless they can keep the Catholic Church and the priesthood on side, this Caddy constitution will have no chance of success at all. So they do accept a privileged position for the Catholic Church. And that, I think, is important for the evolution and spread of constitutions, because it means that in some predominantly Catholic states in different parts of the world, constitutions begin to seem more acceptable. Because to begin with, they're very much associated, in part because of the United States, with Protestant regimes or with systems that want to separate church and state. If you are a relatively conservative Catholic polity, you can now look at the Caddy Constitution as a model and say, look, it doesn't have to be a separation of church and state. We can have a new constitution and keep the Catholic Church as well. So,
well, yeah, and you mentioned the Constitution of Sadek Bey in Tunisia, which also was not in conflict in any way with Islam, and was intended, I think, to serve as an inspiration for other Islamic regimes. But I mean, that one, and also the Nakaz of Catherine the Great, and the Ottoman Constitution, the Austro-Hungarian Constitution, and later the Meiji Constitution. I mean, they really put the ruler, whether it be the emperor or the king, in a really primary role, primary position. And you know, I guess a lot of people would wonder why would they need such a constitution, right, to bolster their authority if it is indeed an empire, right? If these rulers are aspiring to be absolute in some way.
well, by this time, you know, by the end of the 19th century, certainly most monarchs are not remotely absolute. And so, but they're still there, they're still important, they are still in many areas patriotic figures. So you may, in those cases, want a constitution which says, and this is true of Japan, you know, the emperor or the monarch is the head of state, he's an important guy, he has these privileges, but you may then want to say, but as regards legislation, the monarch needs the approval of the legislative body or whatever. So you may then want to use a constitution, not to get rid of a monarch, but to circumscribe his powers and to make clear that there's a more complex, mixed form of government, and you want to set it out. And that's what they do in the Meiji Constitution, which is such an important and long-lasting constitution. It lasts until Japanese defeat in the Second World War. It's very reverential to the emperor, who is emphatically head of state, the Japanese emperor. But if you read the Meiji Constitution very carefully, in all sorts of ways, it's chipping away at the emperor's supreme power. It's saying, yes, he can do this, but he can't do that. Or, yes, he can do this, but he must have approval there, whatever.
Yeah, you talk about there's this famous painting of the emperor handing the Constitution down to his subjects. And you said that what's left out is that there's one of his subjects handed him the Constitution before that. And so it was really not emerging from the emperor, but rather was sort of presented to and almost imposed on the emperor, right?
Yeah. I mean, that wonderful Japanese woodcut is a complete fake. I mean, it didn't happen like that. But it was important to suggest that the emperor, as a grand imperial gesture, was bestowing this wonderful constitution on the Japanese people. Whereas, as you say, in fact, his ministers, very powerful ministers, have spent many years drafting the constitution, and they draft it, they finish it, and then they say, here you are, Your Majesty, and they hand it to him, and he hands it back. It's, you observe the proprieties, but the politics, in fact, are rather different.
And this character Ito Hirobumi is really quite an interesting person, along with his companions, the Chosu Five. I learned about them. But one thing I didn't realize you brought to my attention, when I think about the founding fathers in America, I always think of them as lawyers, and that they were inspired by corporate formation and so forth. But you mentioned that a pretty good percentage of them were soldiers. Mm-hmm. And so military strength was really front of mind for them in order to protect the young nation from invaders and from potential conquerors and adversaries. And I think big thrust of this book is that the constitutions are in some ways part of the sinews of power, right, to provide these nations with ample military resources to compete. And I think that's presumably go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that you can, of course, be both a soldier and a lawyer, and many people were. But as far as Philadelphia in 1787 is concerned, the great convention that is held there, it's chaired, of course, by Washington, the ultimate soldier, and many of the attendees are wearing uniform, military uniform. So there's a considerable military background present among the delegates. But it's also the case that nobody knows and can feel sure in 1787 that this creation is going to hang together, because state rights are so important, which is why all kinds of compromises are made on slavery to try to keep the southern states in line. Because certainly if they had taken a thoroughly principled line on slavery and said, disgusting, it's not going to be in the Constitution, we're going to ban it, the Southerners would have walked out and gone home, including perhaps George Washington. So there had to be all those compromises, and one of the reasons there had to be those kind of compromises was that if the new union did break up, what was there to prevent the Spanish Empire to the south, the French, the British who are up north in Canada, along with the Russians? They could come south. The Spaniards could move north. Moreover, if you didn't create a strong system, what about all the guys and the women who had moved westwards? They might want to create their own separate nation, as of course some of them did for a long time. So it's easy now to think of this as the product, merely the product of victory, but it's also the product of considerable anxiety. Nobody knew what the future would bring. They had to sort out the revenue issue. And if you look at the Madison's transcript of the debates in Philadelphia in 1787, it is striking just how much time is devoted to the issue of tax, trying to get the states working together, trying to think, what are we going to do about constructing a proper navy to repel attack? What about armed resistance and so forth? So there is a lot of apprehension and anxiety in Philadelphia, not just a euphoric sense of we won.
Now I want to turn to Britain, because it seems a bit ironic that the one place that seems to lack a written constitution is the inspiration for so many. I think you quote Bolivar, who said that he wanted his regimes to be like England, and so he proceeds to draft a constitution. But the English were in the constitution writing business. You said something like, even early, before the end of the book, there were something like 70 constitutions that Britons had written for their subject countries, but they were also writing them for other people. Bentham was a big constitution proponent. So why is it that the English never felt the need to put the implicit constitution into writing? Or should we view the various acts of union as forms of constitution, or the Magna Carta as sort of a proto-constitution?
There are these very important documents like Magna Carta, like the British Bill of Rights or the English Bill of Rights of 1689. Then you've got the Acts of Union, the 1707 Act of Union, Treaty of Union between England and Wales on one side and Scotland on the other. So there are these very important statements of principle. But yes, I mean, the British system is very complicated, very difficult to understand and get a grip on unless you are a serious lawyer, because it's built so much on individual statutes and precedents, and because of the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty. And this is a real sort of obstacle to the introduction of a constitution, though I still believe that this will actually happen. But the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty is that one Westminster Parliament, say the Parliament in existence now in London, cannot tie its successors. So it cannot therefore issue a new political constitution, because what happens if the next Parliament says, no, we don't want that. We want we want something completely different. So there's all sorts of restraints on people's thinking. But I think there's also practical considerations. Britain had this massive civil war in the mid-17th century. It had a violent change of royal dynasty in 1688. Both of those crises produced new constitutional rulings. But after that, there hasn't been anything equivalent. There hasn't been a successful foreign invasion of the island of Great Britain. There's been various risings and so forth, but there hasn't been a major revolution. There hasn't been a civil war. Now, in Ireland, the case is different because parts of Ireland rebelled, created their revolution in the middle of the First World War, hence the creation of the Republic of Ireland. But you haven't had anything similar in the rest of the UK. And I think that's a fundamental reason why the current messy system has remained. There hasn't been a major military crisis whereby an entirely new regime has had to stand up and say, look, we are going to be different in the future, so we better write it down. Now, you might think that one reason why this might change in the future, I think there's other reasons, but one reason this might change in the future is if Scotland successfully establishes its autonomy. We know that Scottish nationalists would like a written constitution of their own. If they parted company with the rest of the UK and created their own codified constitution, I think there would be, for all sorts of reasons, considerable feelings in London and elsewhere that, okay, our paths have diverged, perhaps we should redescribe the rest of the UK, what's left, in a new constitution. So that's one possible future. But we'll see. But we haven't had a major crisis of that sort since the separation of a substantial part of Ireland in the crisis of the First World War.
Now, sometimes when these constitutions are created, that serves as an announcement of national identity. But without a national constitution, how did the British acquire a national identity? It seems like a process that doesn't have any specific starting point, right? And even to this day, it's peculiar how Britons can identify themselves both as English people and as Britons, Scots and Britons. And I was talking to another guest about football, and it seems like, Britain is the only country where you have a football team that doesn't represent the nation, it represents the portion of the nation, right? The Welsh football team and the Scottish football team. So, I mean, how did the idea, the notion of being a Briton emerge? Was it sort of formed in warfare?
Yeah, warfare was really rather, in my 1992 book, Britain's Forging the Nation, I suggested that one of the growing cements between the different parts of the UK, and particularly England, Wales and Scotland, was that in the long 18th century, from 1688 to the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Britain fought successive wars with France, a Catholic power, a mighty Catholic power, and that this focused attention on British survival, British identity, as a powerful Protestant state, not a Catholic state like the enemy France. And also, of course, Britain was increasingly successful. And when it comes to identity, nothing succeeds like success. The United States demonstrated that as the United States became increasingly powerful, increasingly rich. It wasn't only principle that made people support the American Constitution and the idea of being American. It was the sense that, hey, you on the winning side. But of course, in the British case, what will happen in the future in the United States case, I don't know, but this is a mighty country. But in the British case, the power and the success has notably receded since the Second World War. There's been more uncertainty, therefore, about national identity, British national identity, hence the independence movement in Scotland in part. And so that's another factor that might influence future constitutional thinking, that given that some of the old props of national identity no longer work, would a statement of constitutional unity and definition be helpful? But of course, it's very difficult to produce those when there isn't an emergency necessitating some kind of action. And so politicians tend to muddle on as long as they can because it all takes too much work and thought. But I think it's very interesting, and I think you would be unwise to bet too much money on Britain still not having a codified constitution, say, 50 years from now. I should think you could also make a good gamble on the reverse, that in 50 years' time there will be some kind of codified statement.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned that by the late 19th century, about half of the British troops in India were Catholic, and so Britain had to abandon its sort of national identity as being anti-Catholic, and so it seems like the basis of British identity has changed, and maybe now it's sort of Europe is the bugbear, right, for a lot of Britons. I mean, with Brexit, I mean, does this speak to maybe I think most people emphasize the problem with Brexit and the failure to create a coherent European identity, but does this speak to some extent to the strength of British identity and its inability to dissolve into a larger identity? I mean, one thing that I find striking about Britain is that it is remarkably tolerant towards its immigrants in ways that other European countries are not. I mean, you have a prime minister, and Scotland has a leader, and Wales has a leader, and that are from immigrant backgrounds, and you don't see that in France. You don't see that in Germany. You don't see that in Spain. Is there some connection there between the difficulty in becoming absorbed into Europe and the strength of this new type of British identity?
I think you're right, and this is very striking. And I try and, when I'm teaching the British Empire and Britain to my students here at Princeton, and some of them have the idea that Britain, because it had a big empire, must be a very racist country and so forth. Well, you can certainly find racism in Britain, but as you say, it is astonishing that how many of the top leaders in the UK, not just the British Prime Minister, who is from Asian Hindu heritage, but several of his cabinet, and the former head of Scotland, the Scottish government, he's just moved on, was Muslim. You just don't find that kind of thing in other parts of Europe. And it may be the sheer fluidity and messiness of the British system. Perhaps it does have some benign features like this, like the fact that you don't feel the system of government is as rigid as in some other parts. I don't know, but it's a possibility.
You talk about the potential dissolution of Britain and the separation into Scotland and England and potentially even Wales. But do you see that as a weakening of British identity, or do you see both those local identities and British identity becoming stronger simultaneously?
Well, I don't think Brexit helped in that respect. I was absolutely opposed to Brexit. I thought and think it was stupid. But one of the ways that it was certainly, and I think this is now broadly accepted, one of the ways in which it certainly could have been done much better is that the referendum allowed it allowed a simple majority. So you had 51% wanting to leave the EU and 49% wanting to stay in the EU. This was a dumb thing to do. For such an important shift, you should have said it must be at least, 65, 70% for a change. I think you should also have said that each of the component parts of the UK had to vote either, in favour if the change was to be made. And what happened was that Scotland and Northern Ireland majorities voted to remain in the EU, whereas in England and even more in Wales, a small majority voted to come out of the EU. So it's been a very divisive, as well as, I think, an unfortunate step. And so if there is another referendum on anything, I hope they work it out better. I think it's very interesting that after the Second World War, the restored German system outlawed referenda on the grounds that these were devices that you really needed to leave alone. I mean, you can have referenda on things like, should we drive on the left or the right, or, a referenda, you're always having these in Switzerland, should bread be made in this way or that way? You can do that. But to ask for a public vote on these vast political changes that most people don't know much about is asking for trouble.
Of course, we have them in the state of California almost every year. It gets very messy. Linda, thank you so much for joining me. The latest, go ahead. Were you going to go ahead? Do you say something?
It's been great to talk to you, and I hope the podcast emerges very well and that people like it.
Well, the book is called The Gun, the Ship, and the Pen, but also this new released edition. You've got a second edition. I forget when this came out. This is the revised edition of Britain's Forging the Nation, and this one, Acts of Union and Disunion, which probably needs a second edition as well. Thanks so much.
Take care.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.